4, we're gonna start looking at anabolic and catabolic processes. That's the sum total which makes up human metabolism. How the enzymes mTOR and AMPK tie into those and drive those processes. We're going to look a little bit at body composition, metabolic flexibility, muscle protein synthesis, MPS, and then we're going to look at power to weight ratio and begin to look at some recovery and repair type stuff. I quite like this picture. It's a little bit dated, but I still think it's super relevant. All the things that can go on with heart health and sort of thinking about homocysteine, thinking about methylation processes, thinking about cholesterol profile, inflammation, omega-3 ratios, testosterone levels, nitric oxide, helping foods, the silent killer, hypertension. So these are many elements that will be measured frequently with clients, so we can reduce potential risk in this area and optimize potential health in this area. Obvious relevance to performance, and a little recap on the energy systems and substrate use. So here we can see when you're at percentage of VO2 max, and we looked at the heart rates to help us decipher percentage of maximum heart rate, which will relate quite closely to percentage of VO2 max, particularly if you're keeping going at something for a prolonged period of time. You can work way over your VO2 max for very short periods of time. But anyway, we can see here the harder you work, the more muscle glycogen you use. You still use some fat from within the muscle. Work less hard, you burn less glycogen, and then as the longer we work, the more fatty acids we use as fuel. Hence the benefits for training on an empty stomach to encourage fatty acid use, because been a prolonged period of absence of food. So we're going to look at insulin, carb loading, ergogenics. We've got all the digestive processes to think about, the physical process of chewing your food, swallowing your food, that sort of thing. We can look at digestive enzyme support, hydrochloric acid support where necessary. That may be more applicable for an older athlete. We need to look at the type and nature of the carbohydrate, of course, and that's where our old friends glycemic index, glycemic load, and insulin index all come into the picture. We need to know the sensitivity of the cell. Insulin. One sort of anecdotal way to know if you're getting this right is if the level of pump you get in a muscle when you exercise. So if you're lacking that pump, then usually it's because you're getting either your fueling wrong, or there might be something else going on with the insulin, and you might be overtraining as well. So we've got GDAs, glucose disposal agents, things like alpha lipoic acid, phenyl sulfate, popular a few years ago. We've got low substrate carbohydrates, which have a high energy and low fiber. We've got high glycemic index carbs. We've got the low molecular weight carbohydrates that I spoke about before, things like cyclic dextrin, Vitago, UCAN, and we need to start putting all this into feeding and fasting cycles, depending on where an athlete is in terms of body composition manipulation. So what we're looking at is manipulating this system in order to maximize best body comp, maximize longevity effects, health effects, keep all signs and symptoms of metabolic syndrome at bay. That you might see that with front row forwards, not internationals as much, but yeah, you might see that in club level Premiership rugby, front row forward who isn't looking after themselves. You may see some smidges of metabolic syndrome in that instance. And then we'll walk the, this is why you need a nutrition coach and performance coach, because we need to maximize energy stores, because if you run out, then it's rate limiting for high intensity intermittent sports. And it's a balance between body fat, sometimes cultural situations, health concerns, long-term messages for the athletes and the wider game. The whole reason we're doing that is around controlling insulin, and I know people have looked at insulin and its role, and some people like it as a theory, some people don't. I think with the prevalence of metabolic syndrome, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, I think this is an important message. And as I said to begin with, majority of you guys, you may be working with elites, but if you're like me, you'll be working with lots of normal people too. So that's why we need to get these messages right, so that people can enjoy a healthy and lengthy health span. So I won't delve into this in too much detail because it is a little bit bread and butter, but picking the right type of carbohydrate, the right mixed meal effect, and the way we measure this is via the HOMA score, so fasting insulin, fasting glucose, or functional insulin resistance index, various methodologies, hemoglobin A1C. So ways that we can look at average blood glucose and the efficiency of the insulin and glucose disposal system. Reminder, and I think there is an advantage in delving back into these things, and humans do really well from a learning perspective when you're exposed to repetition. So here we have factors which will influence the rate of absorption of food into the body, into the stomach, into the blood. That puts, when we eat, we're in a fed state, absorptive. Depending on how big the meal is, 2 to 4, maybe 5 hours. It's a massive meal. You'll be fed, and then when the meal's gone, you'll be fasted, post-absorptive, absorptive, post-absorptive. It's one of the first things you learn about as a nutritionist. We've got the pancreas that's going to release insulin. We've got insulin potentiating compounds, glucose disposal agents. We've got the sensitivity of the cell, which would depend on fatty acid balance. We've got advanced glycation end products, which we'll delve into in a bit more detail later on in the section 2. And then we've got stress hormones, which are going to stabilize blood sugar in the absence of food. The fed state is usually triggers with the right aminos and the right amount of protein will trigger mTOR, which is a specific enzyme which will switch on muscle protein synthesis, and then we've got AMPK, which is triggered in a fasted state, which facilitates burning of fatty acids for fuel, releasing growth hormone and things like that. So all interesting stuff to look at and think about. So we delve a little bit deeper, and we sort of pull apart some of the elements of how we can influence food availability. We can see that if we eat in a relaxed manner, mindful eating, we're going to be in a better state of performance. I mean, you could call that an ergogenic habit, actually, one that is actually widely neglected. Then we've got the use, the deeper use of enzymes. We've got the timing and the type of the carbohydrate, and so on. So we're picking this apart, expanding on the pros and the cons of each of these interventions. Things like Vitago, I don't know if you've experimented that, but if you don't drink that quickly, that literally goes like wallpaper paste. So you can't pre-make teams drinks when you use Vitago because it gets too sticky, just too sticky. Got to mix it and drink it. Nice little website, subversity.com, really worth having a little dig around in there actually. Here we can see the sort of balance between AMPK, mTOR, and we're starting to look at compounds which are going to influence that, which we're going to go into in more detail when we're talking about building athlete supplementation programs. But again, we're asking the questions, we're building the bridges, we're starting to get the brain working and thinking which one of these is going to be the best one that I can employ in my strategy, in my protocol that I'm going to give to my athletes. So here we have it. Is a key concept really, shifting from the fasted to the fed state. We've got things which occur in the short term which can be really, really beneficial, but actually if they're chronically raised may not be as beneficial. In fact, more or less every hormone has a negative side effect if it's chronically present all the time. It begins to have a series of maybe not as good consequences. The Saturday to Saturday fueling plan, you can in a bit more detail, so you can pick that apart and see how you might approach that with the right type of menu building strategy, recipe cards, weekly meal planner, and then looking at how that might manifest in terms of different types of food and calorie manipulation. And also, I just dusted off that machine actually, Lumen. Yeah, so you can then see if you're using mostly fat as a source of fuel, and you can manipulate your macros using your preferred app. That might be MyFitnessPal, or it might be Chronometer. Chronometer is like chronometer but without an H. It's really good. It's US centric, but it's really, really good. So what we're doing by doing all this is we're trying to incur more fat loss, more metabolic flexibility. Obviously the whole way through we're going to be measuring fat, measuring body fat via various methods. Definitely more than one method, please. Not just jumping on the scales. They're okay, but they're not sensitive enough on their own as a method of measuring. And this is what we're trying to achieve. Leaner athletes, metabolically flexible athletes, athletes who can burn, and individuals who can burn fat at a higher rate of oxidation. So we're taking the fat max up, and this can be trained. It can definitely be trained. And we look, you only need to look at the athletes that are doing this, keto adapted athletes and things like that. Interesting, actually, with 100 meters, which is almost a purely creatine driven system, that lots of sprint coaches actually advocate a sort of keto approach with their sprinters. Only thing with that is if it's too intense, you're not going to get the adherence. You're just going to get very, very hungry athletes who basically go and get fast food as soon as training's done because they're absolutely ravenous. So in terms of body composition, yeah, we need to. I'm still a fan of the calipers. Setting realistic targets. In a team environment, I think this has got a really beneficial effect. We've got to know that all the interventions are having a positive effect. Sometimes you can, with the regular testing, that will influence other behaviours as well. So that's going to maybe act as a bit of a tidy up for behaviours. They won't be going down the pub as much if they are going down the pub if it's a team-based sport. We need to get the buy-in from the coaches, from the managers, but it's not just about body comp. It's important not just to measure body comp. We also need what I call my Hall of Fame. Hall of Fame is keeping records, really, keeping a good journal, doing the right kind of testing at the right time, bloods, hormones, neurotransmitter questionnaires, well-being, sleep data, all of that's massively important. So I suppose, in some ways, metabolic flexibility is a little bit of a holy grail. It's probably the holy grail for long-term human survival and health, isn't it? It's just that we live in a feast scenario now. So what we can do to try and mimic this feast and fasting approach, which we would have been much more. We're just set up to cope with that. Humans are set up to cope with periods of fasting and then periods of feasting. But clearly we're not getting it right. So the message to the athlete needs to be strong, and hopefully that message, I believe, should disseminate via the athlete through to the general public, and I think that's really, really important. We've got to think about this as a wider message for people. In the spirit of giving you stuff which works quickly, here's a nice little metabolic inflexibility protocol. So this will work. You need to just, keeping things simple, eat more fat, get yourself in a deficit, you're going to burn more fat. Eat enough protein to look after your muscle mass, and eat tons of plants and things like that to stay healthy around that. And actually, we can measure that now. You don't need to go into some fancy lab these days. You can get an at-home testing kit, which is a lumen. So that's a really nice bit of kit. I think they're still working on their dietary advice. I'd potentially override the dietary advice that comes with the app with your own more sensible approach. That's my feeling on it anyway. And let's think about, wrapping up this section now. We're going to talk a bit about muscle protein synthesis. So we've spoken about metabolic flexibility. We've spoken a little bit about fat loss, carbohydrate cycling. What about metabolic flexibility? Sorry, muscle protein synthesis. There we go. So here we've got an interesting conundrum, really. If we're fasting, we're not going to be eating protein. If we're not eating protein, we're going to lack a specific stimulus in order to switch on muscle protein synthesis. So for maximum muscle building, we need maximum number of protein feeds, don't we? That doesn't mean you can't build muscle on a time-restricted eating profile. It just makes it easier to get the calories and the protein in with more frequent feeding. So on a needs basis, I think also around periods of growth, you can have a more frequent feeding protocol. You're not going to necessarily be employing lots of fasting if someone's still growing. It's going to be a mistake. Thinking about muscle protein synthesis in relation to what we need. Well, is your athlete already got enough muscle? Do they need more? Are we trying to maximize the power to weight ratio? Well, probably we are. Do they need to be bigger or smaller? What's their total mass need to be like? What's the current state of their season? Are they in a pre-season where muscle recovery and repair is going to be super important? And then we're going to be thinking about total protein intake, nitrogen retention based amino acid supplementation, the right kind of aminos for mTOR activation, i.e. leucine, feeding frequency, and then the mTOR MPK, and opportunities to fast, really. Opportunities to fast. And then in terms of ergogenics, well, what have we got? What have we got at our disposal? Well, we have creatine, we have citrulline malate, we have HMB, we've got leucine. HMB is a leucine derivative. We've got aminos, we've got total protein intake, we've got protein from food, and the biological value of that protein. And we got to weigh that all up. Pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, protocols and application, budgetary constraints, downsides and possible side effects. Although pretty much everything we're going to be using is going to be super healthy. So, I guess meal frequency and training timing. There was a lot written about this a few years ago, wasn't there? That sort of nutrient timing book, which was interesting. But actually, when we look at the more modern research, actually what you do in a 24-hour period is really the thing which really dictates this. Dictates the efficiency of muscle protein synthesis. Training is the stimulus for muscle protein synthesis, and then protein provides the building blocks to replenish and rebuild. Here we can see a couple of things around how much protein you need. Well, 40 grams gives you a nice big spike in muscle protein synthesis. 20 grams is going to be okay for a younger individual, but actually as soon as you get a bit longer in the tooth, you're going to need a lot more protein in order to overcome anabolic resistance. We've got the leucine trigger, but that's a finite effect, so you need to sort of push the trigger and then resensitize. Then we've got meal frequency and anabolic state. You take a lot of protein in one hit, you're going to get a bigger spike in protein synthesis, but it doesn't really make up for drip feeding it, as I was saying before. Potential to use carbs and BCAAs and get a little leucine spike, but remembering that leucine effect it downregulates. I think there's the 300-minute between spikes, which is a good thing to potentially adhere to. We go 300 minutes and a quick calculator. It's 5 hours. Yeah, 5 hours between really big meals to get the maximum loosening effect. That's potentially, if you're doing 16/8, then you can get that, can't you, in your 8-hour feeding, because you definitely have 5 hours between your feeds. Cool. All right, so we'll wrap all this up. Really, what we're talking about, all of this is about maximizing power to weight ratio. So you do that by increasing your power and decreasing your body fat, and then you need to decide how big you need to be for your sport. Cool. Thanks for listening. Drop us a follow. Have a look at aminoman.com. Drop us a follow on Twitter. It's at Matt Lovell. And then mattlovellstrengthforlife.com. Have a look at that as well. Thanks a lot.